All right, cool. Thanks. So yeah, so Melanie and I will be doing this. Please understand that we're doing this as we would a normal meetup if you were in Seattle with us, or if we had the pleasure of actually coming and visiting with you all. Uh, I made coffee, so this is gonna be pretty uh, laid back. If you all happen to have seen the Google Dev Summit, this initial part is kind of like a catch up from way back. And yeah, I gave that talk with Nicole Sullivan. Melanie and I have been working and presented similar information as this to the CSS working group, the ARIA working group, and numerous other folks. But I'm actually super stoked about the timing of this because we don't have to spend as much time talking about the problem, but we actually get to pivot to, hey, here's a lot of work that has happened over the past year, and kind of start, I would say, teasing to an extent of what's to come, and also get feedback because exciting things are underway. So Melanie, did you want to say a few words before we jump in?
I think you've covered the bulk of it. Just excited to talk to you all today. Hope to find some of you participating in Open UI if this, kind of floats your boat. And we're happy to take questions or comments or anything that occurs to you like after today. Please feel free to reach out. Thanks.
Yeah, so first we'll travel to a long time ago of, I don't know, like 2.5 years now, Melanie. I don't remember how long it's been since we started moving Edge over to Chromium. And that's cool. Awesome. That sounds going cool. Yeah, anyway, so as we were doing the move from Edge HTML over to Chromium, we basically did kind of an analysis of literally everything in the engine. Like, what were things that we felt, no matter your opinions of Edge, like what were the users of Edge going to feel like they lost in the move from Edge HTML to Chromium? And one of the major things that we found was the built-in native controls heavily lacked in fundamentals that we felt should be there, whether they be accessibility, touch, or just having a modern user interface, just something that wasn't in the Chromium controls by default. Basically the HTML one, so whether it's file, color, so on. So we worked actually heavily across with the Google Chrome team and their design team, just to basically come up with a base set of control styles that we were kind of like, hey, this is neutral enough that we can kind of start here. And then when the browsers ship, we can kind of bifurcate on brand. So basically what that resulted in about 1.5 years ago, close to 2 years ago, we ended up shipping the improved controls. This is actually using high contrast native on Windows. And so, like, again, technically at the time of us moving over to Chromium, this wasn't supported. So you can see, like, we have improved range, color, everything is keyboard focusable, even something that, it took some messing around with the C to get right, but even the color well, like you can use keyboard input and jump 10 pixels and stuff with shift tabs and, different things. But upper management, likewise, as they do and correctly question, this is cool from like a, passion project kind of thing, and like does add in that functionality. But I have a fundamental issue with it because when I go across the internet, I rarely see all of the controls you all have just spent 8 to 9 months redoing, which is a valid criticism. But at the same time, like, if anybody works in product management, they quickly understand that you're actually highlighting a problem of this duplication. And so it kind of makes you take a step back and go, why is it that something that we're shipping natively is not being used? Basically, that points to a flaw and a gap in the platform. Something that obviously standards and browsers have just not kept up with and filling that gap. So sure, they meet the needs of some, but obviously they don't meet the needs of everybody. And so we started kind of investigating the space, trying to understand what were the major gaps, what were the major hurdles. We did a bunch of surveys. I won't share all of the data here, but we have links to the surveys at the end of all the results. And so we effectively say, why do you recreate them? And quickly, it kind of becomes abundantly clear that you couldn't change the appearance sufficiently. And this varies greatly. Like, some people, it's just colors. Some people, you'll hear this throughout our talk, that there's a spectrum here of whether, like, how far, even when you say you wanted to add functionality, how much functionality were you wanting to add? Like, there's a broad spectrum there as well. Browser inconsistencies, likewise, was, 27.3. And then accessibility issues was about 2.8%, and 1.8% was just other items. But ultimately, if you look at being able to effectively style the built-in controls and extend them to some extent, you cover over 60% of the reasons people go and build them. And so all of a sudden, it allowed us to kind of take a step back, drill into even this section a little bit further to understand, all right, what are the top 10 controls that are recreated by web developers? And for most of you all, this probably won't shock you. The select, checkbox, date, radio, file, progress button, dialog, text area, and text are the top ones recreated. And when we were looking at this data, though, there was a great question by Boku that they came back and said, can you pivot it a little bit and ask, like, what is the most frustrating? Like, sure, they recreate them, but like which one ticks them off the most? And again, to most of you, it probably wouldn't shock you that select is the one. And so basically that's where we start, looking into this. And one of the things that we kind of, as we started digging into this, again, as with all good businesses, upper management was like, well, cool. But like every top website, there's massive libraries all over the internet, top websites, companies all fund this. So like, what is our native ones bringing to the table that theirs aren't, all these libraries that they're building? And so quickly we were able to, and I'm not joking, we probably spent half a day. We found accessibilities all over the internet. So these at this point are about 2 years old now, but ironically, we're looking into a new checkbox element. And we just did this, and even at checkbox, we were able to find numerous sites that have broken either keyboard functionality, accessible name computation. It kind of spans the gamut, but it kind of shines a light on even the largest of companies. Unfortunately, even to they're trying, like you can see them trying to go about trying to build these things, but because of how complex the sites are and how spread out everything is, and the composability of these different components, they end up having some form of breakdown across the company. At which point we kind of had discussions with numerous design systems and libraries, both at Microsoft, outside of Microsoft. It really didn't matter. Ironically, I had discussions with Salesforce before I worked at Salesforce. And basically everybody was like, yeah, we would love to not actually build the base components themselves. Like, we do want branding, we do want some custom functionality. But like, I mean, when you think about it, rarely are these companies, the product that they're selling, the components, rarely. Ultimately, they're offering some product and building out these components for those fundamentals that the component library systems and design systems should be offering is ultimately not the product. And so they're kind of a cost center to an extent to ensure that those fundamentals are there for their customers using the products they are selling. And one thing that I actually loved, this is from a tweet literally yesterday from an article in CSS Tricks. But yeah, basically this hits the nail on the head. I won't read it all for you, but basically they're talking about how every single time they switch jobs, they basically go implement a new tab component. Basically every time they switch jobs, they realize that there is a duplication of effort happening. And so this is kind of where OpenUI steps in. And I think it's a lot of people ask an interesting question of, you know what, like, hey, HTML has form controls, CSS defines a lot of UI paradigms. What is the need for, a community group? And the argument that I make is there is yet to actually be, through the history of the web, a group that has said, we're going to take this collectively. You end up in this state here, where basically the design systems go, they think about a control in a holistic perspective, a controller component. They think about it holistically. And then they go across all these different specifications, like whether it be ARIA, to some extent, if they're trying to follow standards for future CSS paradigms, they may even be looking at CSS working group specifications and what way ultimately to consolidate and put together what a lot of companies refer to as blueprints or red lines, basically something that is saying, here's not only what it looks like, but here's how it should behave, and here are the implications on accessibility. And what OpenUI is trying to be is that same design system, but from a standards-based perspective, where we're saying, hey, there's a bunch of standardized components and controls across the industry. Let's not pretend we're like brilliant people that are coming up with all this stuff. You brilliant people that exist out in the web, building on top of the web platform, actually are the brilliant ones thinking about these controls and components every day. What do you all do? Kind of bring it together and produce a standardized blueprint for that. And what that ultimately led us to doing is we wanted to ensure that we brought those folks in. It's very easy, and I've actually been seeing it's been kind of going around the internet as of late with certain new features where basically a lot of web developers kind of feel left out. And there's something that the folks that kind of, I would say, spearheaded OpenUI and are heavily engaged is something we never want to lose, is we never wanted to lose its capability of being approachable. Like, as you'll see, as Melanie starts going through some of the new capabilities that are landing, there are complex discussions that have to happen, but they're not ones that a lot of you all aren't already asking as you go rebuild a select or something of that nature. So we always wanted approachable. We want all web developers to feel kind of welcomed and be able to walk in and help define those blueprints to ensure that when these, and hopefully when they become standard HTML elements or new primitives in CSS, you're able to leverage them quickly and successfully, so that you're not having to rebuild these things time after time after time again. So OpenUI basically set out to define a control. And basically what we recognized is that a component is, it's a type of component. A control is a type of component that allows some form of user interaction. Usually it has controller code that manages the transitions, the component states, and the model based on end user interaction with defined parts. If this seems similar to you, you may notice that it's because of the fact that all the controls, as we were investigating this within the browser, actually follow an MVC type paradigm, model view controller. And the reason that this was actually important for us to recognize is because a common trope throughout the history of the internet, when trying to tackle this problem, they feel it's very important that the OpenUI community group is not the first to try to solve this problem. There are numerous people throughout the decades of the web that have tried to solve this problem. But one of the common responses is, but what about future paradigms we haven't invented yet? What about scenarios that we haven't even thought about that we're trying to bake into the web platform? What about those scenarios? So basically, certain companies at times are hesitant to kind of say, hey, today, this is what a tab looks like. And so we're going to bake this into the platform because it may hinder them going forward if they come out with new UI. And so one of the things that I actually like to shine a light on, saying that basically OpenUI is going to leverage this paradigm, less so that we're going to cement and require that all UI follow specific basically look and feel, is due to this. So if you notice, this is actually from Windows 95. You may notice this looks very similar to something that you may use even today in 2021. It's drastically not different, but yet again, it's still not heavily standardized to the point where you can extend it. You'll notice that overall we have a drop down. There's some options you can select. There's a scroll bar here, and you may go, cool, that's Windows. Got it. That's great, Greg. But then we go over here and we're now on Mac again, way back in the 90s, late 80s timeframe. Again, we have a button that you can click. Hey, they've added in a horizontal rule and they have some options, and hey, cool, they got a check mark. But overall, the actual paradigm is relatively the same. We have something that can activate a series of potential options that you may be able to select one or many potential options from, that will ultimately set a value that is corresponding to this component. That is what a select is. It has that known knowledge of what it's trying to accomplish. But ultimately, a lot of us want it to look like this. A lot of us want to be able to take that select, and that's great that it looked like that in 1995, Greg, but we want to be able to make it look like today. We want it to look modern. We want to be able to actually make this into a combo box. We don't actually just want it to be a simple select that you saw in Windows 95. Likewise, hey, we need to be able to add in images. We need to be able to not just show text. We don't necessarily need just a pseudo placeholder to be able to put a square box like you saw on Mac in 98. Or to take it a step further, hey, I have very complex scenarios for touch that I need to be able to leverage, and I want the user interaction to actually be drastically different. I don't necessarily want you dictating desktop on mobile and vice versa. I think a lot of people probably at this meetup agree and understand that sentiment. And that is why that paradigm actually becomes so important, because what OpenUI actually goes in and does is it says, and this is a little bit dated, but that's okay, because ultimately this is about the paradigm. And it's basically saying we're going to go in and name those parts Because if you take a step back to the slide where I was showing, hey, we end up with a design from the designers, and UX and HTML and CSS developers work together to come and say, hey, when I click this button in the default scenario for our select at our company, it is going to open the list box. And ultimately that's going to change, like, you know, ARIA attributes on different parts and so on. Because of the fact the web platform has never taken this stance to say we're going to go define all of the parts, it makes it so that we can't define all those interactions concretely. If you go to the ARIA best practices, the WCAG best practices, basically they do have all the controls and components, and they try, but they kind of have to go, hey, if in this scenario, then this. So you're going through this algorithm basically in your head of, is that my select? Is that not my select? Is that my combo box? Is that not my combo box? And one thing that I think is relatively unfortunate, again, that OpenUI is trying to step in and do, is this actually isn't true across the entire web platform. All of us have used the wonderful WebKit prefixes and Moz prefixes. All of them technically have parts that they've started trying to hoist up that we can leverage. So all the browsers kind of understand this. These are parts that people may want to style, but they likewise have said, we're not going to standardize on these parts. And that then leads to the unfortunate scenario of us having to go rebuild them because we can't depend on that browser interop. By defining those, as I was just saying, it allows us to get very explicit of when this happens, we want this change on this part with these attributes. This not only makes it so that, hey, we can end up with interoperable states for control and component, but it also allows us to be able to say, hey, we're going to make this stylable for you. And then in addition, this allows us to basically make these unit testable. So basically imagine any of your ATs, whether it be JAWS or so on, they can likewise then test against these components and ensure that they're not regressing as they actually ship new features of their or new versions of their AT. So what this ultimately looks like is this is our OpenUI select, this paradigm, and we have basically a slot. And within this slot, we're actually using web component terminology because that is built into the browser and the platforms already. So we've gone ahead and defined this. But what I've been able to do is I'm able to actually replace the content due to this slotting behavior that's like so powerful and rich to me. So I'm able to leverage this to go in and replace different parts. And then ultimately what that thing is, even though I am not setting these, when that part is clicked, it is going through and doing all the necessary ARIA has pop-up. That's what the controller code is doing. I'm sorry, I'm trying to look at my notes for next. So what I want to do that makes it, I think, a little bit more understandable is I'm going to go through here and I'm actually just going to show you a demo real quick of this. So we will escape here. And so basically this is that model that I want to show, that basically the base component for select, it just looks like this. This has no styles applied to it. Can everybody see this all right? Am I zoomed in enough? All right, okay, cool. So this is inherently still a select because again, we're doing MVC, right? So this has the model, this has the controller code, this has the view, albeit very ugly. But if I select this, technically it has changed to ARIA. If I go and I say I want now option 2, you'll see this updates. So it's doing exactly what the select we know and love today, or don't love, but know and it appreciates today, except for it just isn't necessarily, doesn't have layout. So with that though, we're able to then say, cool, let's take that base and then we'll just apply very basic styles. So now this actually looks kind of like the select that we expect and experience. We do that, you can see that we have dismiss happening and stuff. And then this actually, these three right here, were primarily for when I was presenting to standards bodies, because I wanted them to be able to see that, hey, in the world that exists today, and sorry, this is blurry since I've zoomed in, with this paradigm, you can actually achieve the select you ship today. So then we go into like the Chromium desktop again at the time, and you'll see that we have the drop shadow here. We're able to select, again, technically like keyboard works, all that kind of stuff. And then what we then wanted to do is, okay, let's take a step further. What becomes valuable by going this model and leveraging regular web tech is it enables us to remove some of the restrictions that existed in the old select. So you'll see here, I actually have a horizontal rule inserted here. And because of the fact that I can reach in and I can touch everything the way I would a regular element, because all these parts are hoisted to me, and I have complete control and can completely replace and extend them, it gives me that capability of fully mimicking what Bootstrap has created using that built-in same paradigm. So if I take a step back again, this one again was trying to look at, all right, let's say we standardized on this, and this is not a pretty example, this radial display, but it's trying to say, hey, technically again, like if I'm on a watch and I want to select a contact, it's still a select in essence. You're still selecting a contact. The experience is not necessarily, the experience can be very different, but the semantic expectation of what you're trying to achieve is very much the same. Again, I'm sure if we had a ton of time and great designers, we would have been able to do a real radial rather than my terrible CSS grid setup here. But again, technically, you notice it still kind of behaves the way you would expect. And then what we then wanted to show, what this ends up basically being able to do is kind of showing this has the built-in functionality that you would have today, where when you're typing, you have it. But again, that's kind of a terrible experience because I can't actually see what I'm typing. So hopefully I understand how the algorithm is going to go find what I need to find. And hopefully I know the items that are in there in order to keep typing them correctly. And you know, we all spell all country names perfectly. So what I did with this one is this is actually showing the extensibility of that same component. Remember, this is the exact same component that we first started with. And so what we're then doing now is you will see that this appears and feels very much more like a combo box, where now if I wanted to find all the countries that start with S, I've added a filter logic in with this. And as I type, I'm actually seeing what I type. And then I can go down and select. I screwed up the logic there, but that's okay. And anyways, so that's kind of the demo of that. Ultimately, there's a lot of work to do, but hopefully that kind of gives you an essence of what, let me see here from current slide, what that model is capable of doing. And what's exciting about that is it's not necessarily just like a rough idea that is, brainstorming or whatever. There actually is intent to prototype of that customizable select already in Chromium based browsers behind a feature flag, like because we're very early on, we're just playing around. We just wanted to see if the model actually would work at a browser implemented perspective. And this is actually where I'm going to we're going to kind of get into the exciting things because things are changing. So I'm going to actually pass it over to Melanie, who's going to talk about this prototype explorations and where things are headed.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg, for kind of teeing everything up here. Yeah, so as Greg mentioned, we found in the surveys that select was really popping as like the element that people are recreating the most. It's causing the most frustration. So it's kind of like a natural point from which to, kind of stress test some of these ideas that we have as far as like how we're going to unlock controls customization. So Daniel Clark here, he's an engineer with us at Microsoft, filed an I2P, intent to prototype in the Chromium project. If you're not familiar with this, this is just a signal to other Chromium collaborators like, hey, I'm going to be messing around in the code, behind a flag. I'm going to be trying some new stuff out, just say no. So people can kind of be aware that that work is happening and maybe get, involved kind of early. So this is a project that we're collaborating with across, Chromium collaborators. So Microsoft, Google, of course, we're still working with Greg at Salesforce and the rest of the OpenUI community to kind of push this work forward. Yeah, so we're kind of going through the various different parts of a customizable select in the Chromium project. We kind of had looked at different ways of unlocking a more customizable control with, replaceable slots and all that good stuff. We had started with an attribute, basically like customizable or something, but we realized that this could cause like issues with the parser, particularly if this attribute was like dynamically changed. So we've actually decided since then to go with like a completely new element called select menu. And that's kind of what we're prototyping now. So we're going through all the different pieces right now. I know Dan is kind of working on some accessibility pieces in this customizable select. So making sure the keyboard works and that the accessibility semantics are automatically applied to the parts that, the author is replacing in this customizable select menu. So, we're going to keep working on this prototype and we'll be incubating a specification for the customizable select menu in OpenUI. So, keep your eyes peeled for some of that work happening as well. But something that we discovered as we were kind of working on, this customizable select is that we need a good way for authors to swap in their own like list box part. And there didn't seem to be like a really great fit for that, that part yet in you know, the HTML platform. So we decided that we might actually need to introduce something new called pop-up. So next slide. There's actually like a lot of these different kinds of pop-ups all over component libraries, all over web applications. We're talking like transient pieces of UI that basically pop up over you know, any other UI that's in the web application. So this could be like a button menu, this could be a teaching UI, or this could be the list box part of a select. And these are distinguished by being very ephemeral. Maybe they have light dismiss behaviors, meaning, you know, if the user presses escape or sends focus elsewhere, the pop-up is dismissed. And they typically only have, you know, one pop-up at a time, unless, you know, these are like kind of chained together in the ancestry. So we know that, you know, building these pop-ups can be really hard. You know, I used to work on, you know, accessibility API stuff in the platform as well. And I would come across bugs all the time where, you know, someone had like a pop-up that was basically like in, you know, the root like body element. And, you know, basically assistive technologies weren't able to understand like, oh, I'm in this like text, you know, area here. I need to go, you know, to this list box over here. Like combo boxes didn't work, because you know, the assistive technologies didn't understand a flow to those two like elements. And the reason why the pop-up was, you know, kind of in that root element was because people were trying to like layer it in the top layer and escape any like sub scrollers and you know, all that good stuff. So it's like, okay, what if we could just like fix a lot of those issues by introducing something new that will go into a browser managed top layer? So you don't need any like C or Z index hacks. You don't need to like kind of, you know, shove a pop-up somewhere weird in the document. Things will just work. So that's basically where we're going with this pop-up element. New slide. We are literally proposing something called pop-up. This is just like an example here with a button that's related to this pop-up menu. And the name is kind of up for grabs here. We've had a couple discussions in OpenUI of whether this is the best name or not. It turns out naming is really hard in engineering, so we're still working on this one. But you know, happy to get feedback, especially from folks who like aren't necessarily native English speakers. It's really good to get that perspective, you know, because I myself am a native English speaker. So yeah, still working on the name for this, but we expect this to be like kind of like a composable element that you can use for a lot of different things. Next slide. So a couple qualities of pop-up. This will be fully stylable with a highly permissive content model. So, you know, you might have tried to style, you know, the select list box window in the past and have that kind of, you know, render with some effects on top of, you know, other parts of your web application. And you probably ran into problems very quickly with that because it's rendered technically in a separate window. So all of those things would be achievable with the new pop-up element. You know, as Greg mentioned, people want to add, you know, images inside of options, whatnot. That is something that can be done with pop-up. And, you know, it doesn't have to be used by like a list box. It can be used as, you know, teaching UI or anything like that. As I mentioned, this will be rendered by the rendering engine in the document top layer. So no clipping from sub scrollers, no need for Z-index 99999. It will have light dismiss behaviors out of the box, and I'll kind of describe what those are more in detail in a couple of slides. It will also have mutual exclusivity out of the box. So the browser rendering engine will make sure that only one of these is shown at a time, unless they're kind of like chained in the ancestry. So you could have nested like pop-up windows if that's how your navigational structure works. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go through like a fair amount of detail today. So we're going to share with you, slideshow is glitching out. We're going to share with you like some links that you can read, you know, on your own to kind of, get all the details, you know, kind of settled, because I'm going to be throwing things at you kind of quickly. But I just wanted to go over all the features of pop-up real fast. So there are a couple of different ways to show a pop-up, depending on how you like to build things for the web. So you can have, there's a show method, you know, so you can show this pop-up via script. There's an initially open content attribute. So this is actually the attribute formerly known as open, but we decided that initially open was kind of a better name for how we wanted to do this with pop-up. So this is basically saying, hey, when the page loads, show this pop-up. And then that might be hidden via user gesture or something like that. But when the page is shown, initially open. Next. And then you can also have a pop-up content attribute that's applied to another interactive element. So you can add this pop-up attribute. Probably we'll look at that name, you know, further to a button, and then that can, you know, be toggled and basically show the pop-up menu that it's associated with without, you know, writing additional script. That interactivity will just be handled for you. Next slide. Cool. So yeah, there's a couple different ways of setting pop-ups initial focus points. We've decided that pop-up should remain on the current active element by default, instead of moving to the pop-up or anywhere else. And there's like a couple different reasons for that. A good one is like combo box. When you set your focus into, you know, a text element or text input, you don't want that like jumping necessarily straight down into the pop-up that shows upon, you know, that kind of invocation. You want to keep your focus in that text input. There's also cases where you might want to show a pop-up, but you don't necessarily want to steal focus from the user and whatever that they were doing at the time. But there are some ways to easily move focus around as you wish when the pop-up is initially shown. So you can move it to the pop-up itself using our old friend, the autofocus attribute. So when the pop-up is shown, we'll go to the pop-up. You can go hit next. You can also add that to a focusable descendant, and that works as it usually does, kind of like dialogue. So it's like, hey, when you're showing this, you know, transient element, send focus to that button. And then next, finally, you can also send this to the first focusable descendant of pop-up. And so we had some feedback early on where some folks were saying, hey, like, I really just want to send this to the first focusable element. I might not always know what that thing is because, you know, maybe I'm doing something on the fly. I'm like generating content dynamically. So I just want to have, you know, some easy way to just send that to the first focusable element. And so that's basically what this attribute does. Next slide. So there are a couple different, oh, that's interesting. A couple different ways to hide a pop-up as well. You can call a hide method in script. You know, as I mentioned, using that pop-up attribute, you know, will basically toggle visibility. So if you hit a button and the pop-up shown, it'll hide that pop-up again. There's also browser managed user initiated light dismissal. So if the user hits the escape key or the layout of the pop-up or its anchor element is changed, and I'll get to what an anchor element is in a second, or if focus moves outside the pop-up and the item that invokes it, aka the thing with the pop-up attribute, the pop-up will get hidden. So basically, when you start interacting with things that aren't the pop-up, pop-up will be hidden. Next slide. So we have also filed an intent to prototype the pop-up element in the Chromium code base. So Mason Fried, who's an engineer at Google, is basically taking point on you know, a lot of this prototyping work. So the prototype actually very closely follows what we're doing in OpenUI. So it's kind of based off the initial explainer that we wrote. And, you know, it's influencing like how we're doing kind of detail work. So as things change in OpenUI, as people give feedback and we incubate things in a certain direction, that will also like impact this pop-up prototype as well. Next slide. Cool. So this is just a couple pop-up links if you want to learn more. As I mentioned, I'm kind of like rattling off a lot of stuff right now, so it might be helpful to read these in full. So we'll make sure that you have these links. Next slide. And I want to go through another fair set of detail on another proposal that we're making in OpenUI as well, called anchored positioning. So as we're kind of going through some of this pop-up stuff, we realized that a lot of these kinds of pop-ups have a very specific positioning scheme where you basically want to like pin a pop-up to some other element that it describes, and you want to reposition that element based on both the edges of that anchor element, the element it's anchored to, and the viewport boundary. So like if you think about this button menu here that's on the screen, we first have the pop-up anchored to the bottom left of the button, and then we run out of space in the viewport below the button to render that pop-up. So then we would want to flip it and basically have the pop-up rendered above that anchor element. And so this is a lot of stuff to write. There's yeah, I'm seeing Nils nod his head. There's a lot of JavaScript going on here right now to achieve these sorts of things. So we're like, okay, like how can we make people's lives easier? Next slide. So we basically wanted to propose an anchor positioning scheme. So there's one thing that needs to happen either in HTML or script before we get to CSS. Everything else is in CSS, but you basically need to establish an anchor relationship. So basically, in this first example in HTML, I'm basically saying I have this pop-up, it's going to be anchored to this button. So please consider the button as its anchor element. This is also achievable in script if you prefer to write things that way. So, or you need to do something dynamically. So you just dot anchor, basically attribute there. Next slide. And there's like a couple different things that come with this CSS positioning scheme. So one of these is an anchor CSS function. So values such as anchor top and anchor left can be used wherever CSS lengths are accepted in CSS. And this resolves to length, which is the distance between the starting edge of the layout viewport and the named border box edge of the anchoring element. So you're kind of getting like a coordinate basically of that edge. So with this anchor element, we want to be able to provide a preferred and fallback position. So for example, let's just go through this button example. First, we want to anchor the top left corner of the pop-up to the bottom left corner of the button. And that's the snippet that's to the left of the slide. We want to then, if there's no space for that, we want to anchor the top left corner to the top left of the button. And that's that second screenshot there. Otherwise, if there's not space, in that horizontal direction, we want to anchor the top right to the bottom right, or we want to anchor the bottom right of the pop-up to the top right of the button. Next slide. So here we're going to kind of go through exactly how we're going to do that. If you press next, for example, or real quick. So basically we're using, oh, sorry. Maybe go back, yeah. Thanks. Sorry, thanks everybody for dealing with our Vanna Whiting here, if you all have Wheel of Fortune. So basically, one of the things that we proposed here is a position set property and then an @rules syntax. So basically, this my pop-up here is position fixed. It has a position set that is set to our own custom name, which is button menu pause. And I'll get to describing that in a second. But this min width here is basically using those anchor edges, and it's saying that the pop-up should be at least as wide as the button that it's anchored to. So if you hit next. So basically we have this like position set @rules here. We have selectors in that position set, 1, 2, 3, 4. And basically the rendering engine will look at, each of these integers in sequence and say, okay, 1 is your preferred set. So I'm going to start from 1 and I'm going to see if I can render the pop-up or whatever thing you have anchored in the available space in the viewport using the instructions that you gave me at 1. If that overflows, then the rendering engine will go to 2, 3, 4, n. It kind of works the same as like CSS. So we have like 2 different rule sets here with the 1 selector. So those will basically be combined to create like a holistic sense of what rules to use at step 1. So this first rule set here where we have 1, 2, we're basically saying in the horizontal axis, first try anchoring the pop-up's left edge to the button's left edge. And the max width is basically set to the available space from the left-hand edge of the button to the right-hand side of the viewport. Next. And this is where you probably want to like wallow through things a little bit further later on. Then we want to try the right edge to the right edge, pop up to button. And we want to constrain width to the space from the left-hand side of the viewport to the button right edge. Next. So we were kind of doing these horizontal axis, items. Now we're going towards the vertical axis and how we want to, align things there. So first, we prefer in the vertical axis to anchor the pop-up's top edge to the button's bottom edge. So it'll be shown below the button. We want to constrain height to the space between the anchor bottom edge and the viewport bottom edge. Next. And then if there's no space below the button, then we want to try anchoring the pop-up's bottom edge to the button's top edge, and then constraining the height in the leftover space from the top of the viewport. Next slide. We can also have position set functions that are used, and these will just be wrapped around whatever position set name that you use. So for example, largest height would pick the position set that would maximize the pop-up's rendered height without causing overflow. So let's say that we had 3 different positions that would work, to not cause overflow. Basically, the rendering engine would measure those and see, oh, okay, so position number 3 is the one that's going to give me the largest height of this pop-up. So I'm going to pick that one because you told me I want the largest height that doesn't overflow. Whereas, if you hadn't used largest height, it would just pick the first position that works. Next slide. So this is a very active area for discussion. It's something that we're actually, we've been talking about in the past couple Open UI meetings, because there's so many different ways that we could go about this problem. And, different people have different mental models for how they think about this issue. So there are some other proposed syntaxes in the initial explainer that we filed. Some of these may address perf issues inherent with the @rules syntax that I just showed. We did also have an initial set of anchor foo properties instead of this @rules syntax. We had initially thought that might not be accepted by the CSS working group or the CSS community, because we're basically adding a lot of new properties, and some of which kind of overlap with existing things and their purposes. So whenever you're adding a lot to the platform, it's kind of okay, let's make sure that this is the right way to do this, and we can't reuse something that already exists. However, we did get feedback on position sets, whichever syntax, that for some folks, they were maybe overpowered for their use cases, and they might prefer something a little bit more magic. So there's, can't remember what it's called right now. There's a JavaScript library that basically allows you to say flip V or flip, whatever. Or I think it's just flip actually. So you basically can use a keyword and it'll reposition for you instead of having to write out, some of the different positions that you want to use. So some folks, they kind of feel that's a little bit more comfortable. So we're actively discussing this to see okay, how can we support the needs of people who need something super simple? And then how can we support the needs of people who are okay, well, in this case, I want it here. And in that case, I want it there, very complex needs for repositioning. So the way that the conversation is kind of leading right now is towards like mutual inclusivity. So perhaps we need the anchor edge functions that I showed, because it's nice to be able to measure those links. Perhaps we want anchor foo properties for the simpler positioning and repositioning. And maybe we want to keep looking into the @role syntax for more complex use cases and repositioning. So there's other ideas kind of throwing out there. It's like, oh, what if we try to align with container queries? Is there something to query that makes sense here? Could we do we need the anchor, edge functions if we can do something interesting with, a new containing block, for example? So I would say, like, if you want to get involved in pushing CSS forward and having an impact on CSS, this is an awesome discussion to get involved in, because it's very active, and there's a lot of people excited about it. So please feel free to join us in OpenUI, which is where we're incubating this before it would go to CSS working group. Next slide. Cool. And then these are just like anchor positioning links that you can read through. There's the initial explainer there. There is an open issue with like a ton of discussion on the syntax. As I said, this is a very active area. If you want like kind of a cheat sheet here, just find the slides deck that's in there that Una added, and you can kind of find some discussion from that point. Is a good place to start if you don't want to read this whole thing. So that's, anchor positioning. Before I hand it off to Greg, I just want to say that I showed a lot of features today. I talked a lot about pop-up as I was showing those, but there is applicability to other elements and other scenarios for some of the features that we've shown. And so the idea is to think about how can those be extended to other parts of the platform, to be useful. So, just bear that in mind. Okay, Greg, do you want to pick it back up?
Yeah, so thanks so much for all of that. Melanie, we have like one quick subject. Like the thing that I kind of want to hit on is if you go back to that initial problem statement of why the whole problem statement is, let's have a built-in UI toolkit that enables developers to basically have the flexibility so that they don't need to, at least for the 80% scenarios, don't have to go write their own controller component. Like, let's just make sure that they can do that. And there's a broad spectrum. Like as you saw in that the survey very early on in the pie graph, some of them truly, if you look into, they can't style them enough. It's solely, truly just the colors. Like they don't necessarily, the functionality is fine for what they're trying to achieve. They like the controller code and the model. They just have a very small tweak they want to make to the view. And this was kind of seen when the Chromium refresh happened. Chrome actually shipped with a blue color for all of their accents. And as you can imagine, let's say, like, not saying this happened. Actually, I'll just leave out names so I don't get in trouble. But let's pretend your brand is red and the defaults that happen to ship with Chrome is blue, and you've been using the native checkboxes because you like prefer to not rewrite them. Well, all of a sudden you have kind of an issue because your brand is red and you want that checkbox to be red. You don't technically want to recreate all of it. You just want the accent color to be red. Well, so in order to address this and address anybody that's like, hey, I'm totally cool with the built-in controls as they exist now, I just kind of want to change the color. Chrome, the Google team introduced into the CSS working group an accent color method that actually will be shipping in Chromium 93. So literally tomorrow. And then Firefox 92 in September 7th. And all you have to do is say accent color is pink. And basically what that ends up doing, you don't have to say pink. You can say whatever color you want. But basically, as you can see here, you're able to adjust it to whatever you want it to be. So like in that red and blue scenario, I would have said, I want to be red. The thing that's great is this is basically a very magical thing. And as I really want to hit on that being magical, because for so long, and so I loved Melanie bringing up that, hey, web developers were like, we want some more magical, because when I reach for Bootstrap, it just gives me that magic thing. I don't want to think about all the complexity that you're necessarily bringing to the table, even though I know it's more powerful. We will, like, for the platform for so long, we've been like, let's explain the platform. Let's unlock all of the primitives that have existed in the platform. And so often what we've heard from web devs is, I don't want to go write a full library to simplify the platform that you've given me. And so this is one thing I love about accent color, because basically you're telling the browser, hey, you know your parts. Remember, OpenUI is trying to define all those parts, but this is a great initial step because it's saying, you know your parts, please go change them using this color. And then on top of that, by the way, ensure they're accessible, because I'm going to give you a color. You're going to know way more about the page and the form control and everything that you've decided to make a part of that form control. Please ensure that they're accessible. And that's kind of what it's trying to show here, that you've provided that one color and it's kind of saying, hey, we're going to ensure accessibility no matter where we render using the colors that you've provided. So that whether you're on dark, whether you're on light, depending on what the background you ultimately end up being on, we'll adjust the color as best as we can, but also ensuring what we know our users are going to require. So I'm super stoked about that one coming out, and using that pink example I showed earlier. Here's those Chromium ones now adjusted using pink rather than the blue that ships in Chrome, or I think it's the grayish color that ships in Edge. Basically, the Chromium defaults now are replaced with your brand color. And as you can see, it's drastically different. Like if this was my brand color, I'm kind of okay with these all of a sudden. Like they're not so different that I need to go reach for something else for these ones. Now, granted, if functionality is different, and or you're like, I hate circles on a range slider, and rather than be squares, then yeah, okay, at that point, then yeah, you need to start going reaching for something else. But I'm just super excited with all the progress that has happened. And as Melanie said, ultimately, all we're trying to do is get involved. OpenUI, I've actually been so thrilled with the discussions, because I feel like every call it's increasing in basically web developer engagement. Like we didn't hit on it here because it literally could be its own talk, is like tabs is being heavily investigated by like a subgroup of folks. They have a web component built that's doing with heading in the direction that they think it would be. But like we have a Discord server, feel free to jump on there, spin up channels if you're like, man, I really love the range control and I want to make it amazing. Go grab a few different people. We'll help you walk through it. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we have spec authors that are in there from Whitworth heavily reviewing, like pop-up, for example, with the expectation that these will become HTML elements. As you saw from Melanie, again, just spearheading the anchor positioning. As you're working on this, you may find primitives that don't exist in CSS or even JavaScript or ARIA, for example. Like OpenUI is trying to look at that one controller component holistically, and select menu started us off, and Melanie and group said, hey, we need a pop-up element. And we can use it in 90 different ways. So let's make sure we solve it for 90 different use cases, not just select. But hey, look, we're getting a pop-up element out of it, in addition to still being on the journey to solving select. So we're super excited. We're on Twitter, GitHub, Discord, everywhere you would expect us to kind of be. We want participation, engagement. Feel free to hit up Melanie, myself, basically anybody on the Discord channel. Happy to help get anybody engaged.